In a small town nestled between forgotten hills and whispering forests, something happened that made geneticists question everything they thought they knew about human biology. Two identical twin sisters married two identical twin brothers in a double wedding ceremony that the locals still whisper about today. But what came after that wedding night would haunt medical professionals for decades to come. The children born from these unions carried DNA so eerily similar that laboratory technicians ran the tests 5 times, convinced their equipment was malfunctioning. What they discovered was not just scientifically impossible, it was something that shouldn't exist in nature. This is the story of how an ancient family tradition, buried beneath layers of secrecy and shame, created children who existed in a genetic twilight zone that science had no name for. Dr. Rebecca Thornton had seen thousands of DNA reports in her 23 years as a genetic counselor, but nothing prepared her for the file that landed on her desk on a gray October morning in 2019. 2 families had come in for routine genetic screening, something about inherited heart conditions that ran in their bloodline. The paperwork seemed normal enough. 2 couples, 4 children between them. Standard family health history forms. But when the lab results came back, Rebecca's hands started shaking so violently she had to set down her coffee cup before it spilled across the confidential documents spread before her. The children, cousins by family tree, separated by different parents, showed genetic markers that were identical. In ways that should have been statistically impossible, their DNA didn't just share the typical 25% overlap you'd expect from cousins. No, these children shared nearly 50% of their genetic code. They were, for all intents and purposes, genetic siblings, full biological siblings, despite having different mothers and different fathers. Rebecca had spent 2 decades studying human genetics, had published papers on hereditary diseases, had counseled families through the most complex genetic puzzles imaginable. But this defied every principle she'd built her career upon. She picked up the phone 3 times before finally calling her supervisor. "We need to run these tests again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something's wrong with the samples. But deep down, in that place where instinct lives before logic catches up, Rebecca already knew the truth. Nothing was wrong with the samples. Something was wrong with the families. The Harrington twins, Emma and Olivia, had always done everything together. Born exactly 7 minutes apart, they'd shared a room, shared clothes, shared secrets whispered in a language only they understood. They finished each other's sentences before either had spoken a word. When one felt pain, the other reached for the same spot on her own body. Their connection went beyond the usual twin bond that psychologists love to study. It was something deeper, something almost supernatural in its intensity. The Morrison twins, Marcus and Matthew, were cut from the same cloth, identical in every measurable way, from the small scar above their left eyebrows to the way they both tapped their fingers when they were thinking. They'd grown up 3 towns over, in a community so small that everyone knew everyone's business, or at least they thought they did. The Morrison family kept to themselves mostly, living in an old farmhouse that had been in their bloodline for 6 generations. Local kids told stories about that house, how lights flickered in the windows at odd hours, how you could hear singing in a language that wasn't quite English drifting from the property on foggy nights. When Emma met Marcus at a regional business conference in Portland, the attraction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Within weeks, she'd introduced him to Olivia. Within months, Marcus had brought his brother Matthew into the picture. The 4 of them formed a bond so tight it made their friends uncomfortable. They moved as a unit, thought as a collective, planned their futures as if they were a single organism with 8 limbs and 4 minds operating in perfect synchronization. The double wedding took place on the autumn equinox, in a ceremony that blended traditional vows with unusual rituals that none of the guests quite understood. The venue was the Morrison family farmhouse, despite Emma and Olivia's parents suggesting a more conventional location. Old Mrs. Morrison, the twins' grandmother, presided over certain portions of the ceremony that weren't printed in the program. She spoke in that strange, melodic language some of the guests had heard rumors about. She tied red cords around their wrists in patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift in the candlelight. She whispered blessings, or were they bindings, that made the air in the old barn feel thick and electric. Blood calls to blood, she'd said during the reception, her ancient eyes gleaming with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been warning. The circle closes. The line continues. As it was, as it is, as it shall always be. Most guests dismissed it as eccentric family tradition, the ramblings of an old woman too fond of folklore and mystery. But Emma's mother felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the October air creeping through the barn walls. Emma gave birth to a daughter, Sophie, in late summer. Olivia delivered a son, Lucas, just 3 months later. The cousins were raised almost as siblings. The two families lived in adjacent houses on the Morrison property, shared meals, shared childcare, shared everything. As the children grew, people began to notice something unusual. Sophie and Lucas didn't just look similar the way cousins sometimes do. They looked like fraternal twins, same nose, same chin, same unusual amber-colored eyes that neither family had seen in generations. Same birthmark on their left shoulders, a shape that resembled a tree with branches reaching upward. When Sophie was 5 and Lucas was 4, Emma's second daughter was born, a girl they named Claire. And when Claire was 6 months old, Olivia had her second child, a boy named Ethan. And again the pattern repeated. Claire and Ethan could have been twins separated by half a year. The resemblance was so striking that strangers often asked if they were looking at identical twins, even though one was clearly male and one female, and their birthdays were months apart. The 4 children grew up believing they were simply very close cousins. They played together, learned together, seemed to communicate in glances and gestures that required no words. Teachers at their small private school often mixed them up, unable to distinguish which child belonged to which parent. Parent-teacher conferences became awkward affairs where even the mothers sometimes had trouble remembering which child had which report card. It was Sophie's routine heart screening, that genetic predisposition to cardiac issues that ran in the family, that finally pulled back the veil on what families had tried to keep hidden, perhaps even from themselves. Dr. Thornton requested a meeting with all 4 parents. She sat them down in her office. The DNA reports spread across the table like accusatory evidence at a trial. Emma and Olivia sat on one side, holding hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Marcus and Matthew sat across from them, their identical faces wearing identical expressions of carefully controlled anxiety. "I need to ask you something," Rebecca began, choosing her words with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. "Are you aware that Emma and Marcus are identical twins, and that Olivia and Matthew are identical twins?" The question hung in the air like smoke, curling around them, suffocating in its implications. "We're not related," Emma said quickly, too quickly. "The girls and we're from the Harrington family. The boys are Morrisons, completely different bloodlines." But Rebecca had already done her homework. She'd spent the past 2 weeks digging through genealogical records, census data, old newspaper archives. What she found had made her lose sleep for 4 consecutive nights. "Your families are connected," she said gently. "Going back 6 generations, your great-great-great-great-grandparents were siblings who married into different families. And then, in each generation, there were marriages between the descendant lines. Not every generation, but enough times that your genetic diversity became dangerously compressed." She pulled out a family tree she'd constructed, lines connecting names across decades and centuries. The Harrington and Morrison families have been intermarrying for over 150 years, sometimes openly, sometimes secretly, Your children don't share 25% of their DNA like typical cousins. They share nearly 50% because you and your spouses are, genetically speaking, much closer to siblings than to unrelated individuals. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's impossible. We didn't know. How could we have known? But Matthew remained seated, and for the first time, the identical twins showed a crack in their unified front. Matthew's face carried an expression of resignation rather than surprise. Grandmother knew, he said quietly. She always knew. Old Mrs. Morrison was 93 years old, living in a nursing home that smelled of antiseptic and forgotten memories. When the four parents confronted her, she smiled that enigmatic smile that had unsettled wedding guests years before. "Of course I knew," she said, her voice still strong despite her frail body. "It's the family way. Has been for longer than you'd believe." She told them a story that sounded like folklore, like the kind of dark fairy tale that people tell around campfires to scare children. She spoke of her grandmother's grandmother, a woman named Elspeth Morrison, who'd arrived in America from somewhere in Scotland in 1847. Elspeth had brought with her traditions older than Christianity, practices that the church had tried to stamp out but could never quite eradicate from the remote Highland communities. She believed that blood held power, Mrs. Morrison explained, her ancient hands folding and unfolding in her lap. That families were strongest when the bloodline stayed pure. Not pure in the way those evil men in history meant it. Not about race or superiority, but pure in the sense of concentrated, distilled. She believed that when blood called to blood, when cousins married cousins across generations, something awakened. Olivia's voice cracked on the word. "What are you talking about?" The old woman's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing things that existed in a different time, a different reality. The children born of such unions were special, connected in ways others couldn't understand. They could sense each other across distances. They healed faster. They lived longer. They carried something ancient in their bones, in their blood. Elspeth called it the old gift. She said it was why our ancestors survived when others perished, why our family thrived when others failed. But the children, Emma interrupted, her voice desperate. What about the genetic risks, the diseases, the abnormalities that inbreeding causes? Mrs. Morrison fixed her with a sharp gaze. Are your children sick? Do they suffer from any of the conditions those medical books warn about? The silence that followed was answer enough. Sophie, Lucas, Claire, and Ethan were remarkably healthy. No genetic diseases, no developmental delays. If anything, they seemed brighter, more intuitive, more physically capable than their peers. Elspeth had her ways, the old woman continued. Rituals, ceremonies, protections. She knew which unions would strengthen the line and which would weaken it. She knew how to read the signs, how to guide the bloodline safely through the narrows. And she passed that knowledge down through the women of our family, from grandmother to granddaughter, skipping the sons because they couldn't be trusted to keep the secrets. And you, Marcus demanded. You arranged this. You brought us all together. The old woman's smile was neither kind nor cruel, but something beyond moral judgment entirely. I simply removed obstacles, made suggestions, arranged for certain meetings to take place. The blood did the rest. Blood always calls to blood. You felt it, didn't you? That pull, that sense of recognition that went beyond ordinary attraction. Emma and Olivia exchanged glances with their husbands, and in that moment, they all knew she was telling the truth. The intensity of their initial connections, the speed with which they'd all bonded, the sense that they'd known each other forever despite being strangers. It hadn't been coincidence or fate. It had been genetics recognizing itself, blood calling to blood across the divide of different family names and separate childhoods. The parents faced an impossible decision. Do they tell the children the truth? That they weren't just cousins but genetic siblings? That their family tree was less a tree and more a twisted vine that looped back on itself again and again. That they were the product of a breeding program older than America itself, designed to preserve something ancient and powerful but ethically horrifying by modern standards. Dr. Thornton recommended genetic counseling for all 4 children. She explained that while they showed no signs of the typical genetic disorders associated with inbreeding, they should be monitored. She recommended that when they reached reproductive age, they should seek extensive genetic screening before having children of their own. She spoke in careful, clinical terms about recessive genes and genetic load and the mathematics of heredity. But what she didn't say, what she couldn't say without sounding insane, was what she'd observed in her sessions with the children. The way Sophie always knew when Lucas was upset, even when he was in a different room. The way Claire and Ethan seemed to communicate without speaking, their conversations happening in a space beyond words. The way all 4 children, when together, created a dynamic that was greater than the sum of its parts. They were connected in ways that science couldn't fully explain, in ways that made Rebecca question whether the old woman's folklore might contain fragments of a truth that modern medicine had forgotten. As Rebecca dug deeper into the Morrison-Harrington family history, she found the pattern repeating like a dark heartbeat across generations. In 1872, 2 Morrison cousins had married 2 Harrington sisters. In 1903, 3 Morrison brothers had married 3 Harrington cousins. In 1934, during the depths of the Depression when everyone else was struggling, the Morrison-Harrington clan had somehow thrived, their farms productive, their businesses successful, their children healthy while others starved. Local legends whispered about the Morrison-Harrington families, how they kept to themselves, how their children were always a little too bright, a little too perceptive, a little too uncanny. How the families seemed to operate as a single unit despite living in different towns, different states. How they always knew when one of their own was in trouble, arriving to help before anyone had called them. How they aged more slowly than their neighbors, lived longer, died peacefully in their sleep surrounded by family members who'd somehow known to gather even though no one had been told death was coming. The genetic testing revealed other anomalies. The 4 children had telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with age, that were unusually long, suggesting they might age more slowly than average. Their immune markers showed unusual resilience. Their neurological development was advanced in ways that suggested enhanced cognitive processing. Whatever the Morrison-Harrington breeding program had been trying to achieve, it seemed to be working. The children were, by every measurable standard, exceptional. But at what cost? Emma and Olivia met with a bioethicist at the university, trying to understand the moral dimensions of their situation. Dr. Patricia Chen listened to their story with the kind of carefully neutral expression that suggested she'd heard disturbing things before, but this was pushing new boundaries. The question isn't whether your children are healthy now, Dr. Chen explained. The question is about consent and autonomy. Your children were born into a genetic experiment they didn't choose. They carry the accumulated genetic load of 6 generations of strategic inbreeding. And while they show no problems now, we don't know what might emerge as they age, or what they might pass on to their own children. But Mrs. Morrison said, Olivia began. Mrs. Morrison is operating from a belief system that predates modern genetics. Dr. Chen interrupted gently. She believes in folk magic and bloodline power. That doesn't make it real. What's real is that your children are the product of generations of controlled reproduction that reduced their genetic diversity. In any other species, we'd call this inbreeding. In humans, we have stronger words for it. Words that carry criminal penalties in many jurisdictions. Emma felt tears streaming down her face. But we didn't know. We thought we were just marrying the people we loved. We thought it was coincidence that we were twin sisters marrying twin brothers. We didn't know about the family history. Did your husbands know, doctor? Chen asked quietly. That question hung in the air like an accusation. Emma and Olivia looked at each other, both thinking about Matthew's resigned expression when Dr. Thornton had revealed the truth, about Marcus's anger that had seemed more defensive than shocked, about conversations that had stopped abruptly when they'd entered rooms, about the way the Morrison men sometimes spoke in that odd language with their grandmother, the same language she'd used in the wedding ceremony. I think they might have, Emma whispered, or at least suspected. Oh God, I think they knew. When Emma and Olivia confronted their husbands, the truth came out in pieces, like pulling shards of glass from a wound. Marcus and Matthew hadn't known the full extent of the family pattern, but their grandmother had told them things, had shown them the family records, had explained that they were special, chosen, part of something greater than themselves, had impressed upon them the importance of finding the right partners, partners who would understand, partners who carried the right bloodline even if they didn't know it yet. She said you were the ones, Matthew admitted, his voice hollow. That when we met you, we'd know, that the blood would recognize itself, and she was right. The moment I saw Olivia, I felt it, like coming home, like finding a part of myself I didn't know was missing. That's not love, Olivia said coldly. That's genetic programming. That's generations of selective breeding creating a biological imperative that felt like attraction. Can it be both? Marcus challenged. Yes, we were guided toward each other by genetics and family manipulation. But what we built together, the life we've created, the children we love, that's real. The love we have for each other is real, regardless of how it started. Emma shook her head, backing away from him. You let us have children without telling us the truth. You let us bring babies into this world without knowing they'd be genetic siblings instead of cousins. You took away our ability to make informed choices about our own reproduction. That's not love, Marcus. That's control. The argument continued for weeks. The two families stopped sharing meals, stopped living as a single unit. Emma and Olivia moved back to their parents' house with the children, while Marcus and Matthew remained on the Morrison property. Lawyers were consulted. Divorce papers were drafted. The question of custody became nightmarishly complicated when genetic testing revealed that the children's DNA made conventional paternity determinations nearly meaningless. But the children themselves were confused and frightened by their parents' separation. Sophie, now 12 years old, was old enough to understand some of what was happening. She'd been told the truth in age-appropriate terms, that her parents were more closely related than they'd realized, that she and her cousins shared more genetic similarities than typical cousins do. Does that make us bad? She asked Dr. Thornton during one of their counseling sessions. Are we wrong somehow? Rebecca chose her words carefully. You are not bad or wrong, Sophie. You're a remarkable young person who happened to be born into a complicated family situation. You didn't choose your genetics any more than you chose your eye color or your height. What matters is who you are as a person, not the circumstances of your birth. But everyone at school treats us differently now, Sophie said, tears welling in her eyes. Someone's parent found out about the genetic testing and told everyone. They call us the mutants or the inbred kids. Lucas got into a fight last week because a boy said our parents were doing something sick and illegal. The cruelty of children, Rebecca thought, was matched only by the cruelty of adults who gossiped without understanding the human cost of their words. The Morrison, Harrington children had become the subject of whispered conversations, of pointing and staring, of social exclusion. The families were pariahs in a community that had once accepted them as normal, if somewhat private, neighbors. How do you feel about Lucas? Rebecca asked gently. Has your relationship with him changed since you learned about the genetics? Sophie thought about this for a long moment. No, she said finally. He's still Lucas. He's still my favorite person in the world besides my mom. We still have our connection, where I can kind of feel what he's feeling. That hasn't changed. But now I know why it's there. It's not because we're special or magic like Grandma Morrison said. It's just biology, right? Just genetics making us more similar than most cousins. Is that disappointing? Rebecca asked, finding out there's a scientific explanation instead of a magical one. Sophie smiled sadly. Kind of. I liked thinking we were special, that we had some kind of gift. Now it just feels like we're the result of people making bad choices. Like we're science experiments instead of people. Rebecca's heart broke for this child who carried the weight of 6 generations of questionable genetic manipulation. You're not an experiment, Sophie. You're a person. A person with autonomy and value and a future that you get to choose for yourself. Yes, your genetic background is unusual, but that doesn't define who you are or who you'll become. As word spread about the family's genetic situation, authority became involved. Child Protective Services investigated whether the children were at risk. Medical boards questioned whether old Mrs. Morrison's influence over family reproductive choices constituted a form of coercion or abuse. Local law enforcement tried to determine if any actual crimes had been committed. The legal questions were complex and unprecedented. Marrying your cousin was legal in many states, though discouraged. The Harrington and Morrison siblings hadn't known they were as closely related as they were. The marriages had been entered into in good faith, even if that faith had been manipulated by Mrs. Morrison's machinations. And the children, despite their unusual genetic profile, showed no signs of abuse or neglect. They were healthy, well adjusted except for the trauma of their parents' separation and the social stigma they now faced. But investigators uncovered more disturbing details. Mrs. Morrison's journals, found in her nursing home room, detailed the family's breeding program with clinical precision. She'd tracked genetic traits across generations, noting which characteristics strengthened and which weakened. She'd arranged chance meetings between distant relatives, orchestrated careers that brought certain individuals to specific locations at specific times. She'd even, investigators discovered with growing horror, engineered the deaths of family members whose genetic contributions she deemed detrimental to the bloodline's purity. A great uncle who died in a farming accident in 1982, a cousin who'd perished in a house fire in 1995, a sister-in-law who'd succumbed to sudden illness in 2003. Each death had eliminated someone who was about to marry outside the Morrison Harrington gene pool, or who carried genetic markers Mrs. Morrison considered undesirable. The accidents and illnesses had never been investigated deeply. Small town sheriffs and rural medical examiners hadn't looked too closely at deaths in a family known for keeping to itself. The statute of limitations had expired on most of these potential crimes. Mrs. Morrison was judged incompetent to stand trial due to her age and declining mental state. But the revelation that the family's genetic program might have been enforced through selective murder added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Emma and Olivia faced an impossible decision about their marriages and their futures. Stay with the men they loved, accepting that their entire relationship had been built on genetic manipulation and family secrets, or divorce, breaking up the only family structure their children had ever known. The answer came from an unexpected source. The children themselves called a family meeting, all 4 of them standing together in a show of unified determination that reminded everyone eerily of Mrs. Morrison's descriptions of the old gift. "We want to stay together," Sophie announced, speaking for all of them. "We understand that our genetics are complicated. We understand that what Grandma Morrison did was wrong, but we love each other. We love our parents. We don't want 2 broken families. We want one family, even if it's unusual." Lucas added, You're so focused on how we came to exist that you're forgetting we do exist. We're here. We're real. We're not going away. And we get to decide what our family looks like going forward, not some 100-year-old tradition, and not some modern idea of what's genetically appropriate. Claire, younger but equally determined, said, "When I'm grown up, I'll make my own choices about having kids. We all will. We'll get genetic testing. We'll make informed decisions, but that's future us. Right now, we just want our family back." Ethan, the youngest, simply said, "Please don't leave each other because of us. We're okay. We promise we're okay." Their words broke through the adults' paralysis. Emma and Olivia looked at each other, then at their husbands, and slowly, painfully, the family began to heal. Not back to what they'd been. That innocent ignorance was impossible to reclaim, but into something new, something honest. The families moved away from the Morrison property, selling it despite the generations of history embedded in that land. They relocated to different states, finding communities where their story wasn't known, where their children could grow up without being labeled as genetic curiosities or victims of inbreeding. They changed their names legally, creating distance from the Morrison, Harrington legacy. They stayed together as a family unit, but with new rules and new awareness. Extensive genetic counseling, regular medical monitoring, complete transparency with the children about their genetic heritage, and the choices they'd need to make about their own reproductive futures. They broke completely with Mrs. Morrison and the remaining family members who still believed in the old gift and the value of the bloodline program. Dr. Thornton published a paper on the case in a medical journal, with all identifying details changed to protect the family's privacy. It became a landmark study in genetic counseling ethics, used in medical schools to discuss consent, family secrets, and the complicated intersection of genetics and human relationships. She argued that while the family's genetic compression was concerning, the children's health and well-being depended more on love, support, and informed medical care than on the circumstances of their conception. The children grew up knowing their truth. They formed a support group for themselves, processing their complicated heritage together. As teenagers, they became activists for genetic literacy and reproductive rights, speaking at conferences about the importance of genetic testing and informed consent. They turned their unusual story into a mission to help others avoid similar situations. Sophie eventually became a genetic counselor herself, following in Dr. Thornton's footsteps. Lucas pursued law, specializing in reproductive rights and family law. Claire became a psychologist focusing on family trauma. Ethan went into social work, helping children in complicated family situations. Each of them took their pain and transformed it into purpose, but questions linger. Was Mrs. Morrison's belief in the old gift entirely delusional, or was there something to the family's unusual characteristics? The children did show remarkable traits: advanced cognition, unusual emotional sensitivity, strong intuitive connections with each other. Were these simply the results of being raised in a close-knit, supportive family environment? Or did genetics play a role in ways that modern science doesn't yet fully understand? And what about the ethics of the situation? The parents had been manipulated, yes, but they'd also created healthy, thriving children who loved each other and brought joy into the world. Was the manner of their conception enough to overshadow the value of their existence? Where is the line between protecting genetic diversity and policing family formation? The Morrison-Harrington case raised uncomfortable questions about reproductive autonomy, genetic privacy, and the limits of family secrets. It challenged assumptions about what makes a family healthy or unhealthy, normal or abnormal. It forced medical professionals, ethicists, and legal experts to grapple with scenarios they'd never imagined encountering in real life. Today, the 4 children are adults with families of their own. They underwent extensive genetic screening before having children, working with reproductive specialists to minimize any risks from their unusual genetic background. Their children, the next generation, are healthy and normal by all measurable standards. The genetic compression of previous generations diluted by careful partner selection and medical intervention. The family maintains minimal contact with the Morrison relatives who still believe in the bloodline program. Old Mrs. Morrison died at age 97, taking many of her secrets to the grave. Her journals, sealed by court order, remain locked in a university archive, available only to qualified researchers studying historical cases of organized inbreeding. Emma and Olivia eventually wrote a book about their experience, published under pseudonyms. It became a surprise bestseller, resonating with people who'd discovered family secrets of their own, who'd had their world shattered by genetic testing, who'd learned that their families weren't what they thought they were. The book's message was one of resilience and choice, that we are more than our genetics, more than the circumstances of our birth, more than the families that made us. Marcus and Matthew spent years in therapy, processing their own roles in perpetuating their grandmother's scheme, even if unknowingly. They had to reconcile their genuine love for their wives with the manipulation that had brought them together. They had to learn to separate their identities from their family legacy, to become individuals rather than links in a genetic chain. The story of the twins who married twins, whose children were born as genetic siblings, became a cautionary tale in medical schools and ethics classes. But more than that, it became a story about the complexity of family, the weight of secrets, and the resilience of love in the face of impossible circumstances. Because in the end, what defined this family wasn't their genetics. It was their choice to stay together despite learning the truth, their choice to love each other through the horror and the shame, their choice to give their children a future unconstrained by the past, their choice to break a cycle that had lasted 6 generations, to say that this pattern stops here, that these children will be free to love and marry and reproduce based on their own choices, not on the dictates of an ancient family program. They transformed a story of genetic manipulation into a story of human agency. They took a legacy of secrecy and control and turned it into a message of transparency and autonomy. And their children, those genetic siblings born to different parents, grew up to become advocates for the very principles their family had violated: consent, choice, and the right of every individual to make informed decisions about their own genetic legacy. The Morrison-Harrington case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, genetics, and the lines we draw between acceptable and unacceptable. It reminds us that genetic testing can reveal secrets that shatter families, even as it provides valuable medical information. It challenges us to think deeply about what we owe to future generations, and whether we have the right to engineer genetic outcomes even with the best intentions. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every genetic statistic, every DNA report, every medical anomaly, there are human beings trying to love each other and build meaningful lives. The 4 children at the center of this story didn't ask to be born into a genetic experiment. They didn't choose their unusual heritage, but they chose how to respond to it. They chose resilience over victimhood, transparency over secrecy, love over shame. Their story continues to unfold, as all family stories do. They carry the weight of their past but refuse to be defined by it. They honor their genetic reality while asserting their human autonomy. And in doing so, they offer hope to anyone who's discovered that their family isn't what they thought it was, that their origins are more complicated than they knew, that the truth is harder and stranger than any story they'd been told. Because families are never simple, genetics are never straightforward, and the question of what makes a family healthy or unhealthy, normal or abnormal, acceptable or unacceptable, is far more complicated than any simple answer can capture. The twins who married twins learned this the hard way. Their children live this truth every day, and their story serves as a reminder that we are all navigating the complex intersection of biology and choice, heritage and autonomy, the families we're born into, and the families we choose to create. If you found this story as shocking and thought-provoking as we did, please share it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the genetic mysteries that challenge our understanding of family, identity, and what it means to be human. And if you have your own story of genetic discovery or family secrets that changed everything, share it in the comments below, because these stories matter. Your story matters. And together, we can build a conversation about genetics, ethics, and family that honors both scientific truth and human dignity. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are more than your DNA, but your DNA is part of your story. Make it count.